Ladies and gentlemen, our speaker for today's annual day lecture, Honorable Union Minister for Finance, Corporate Affairs, Information and Broadcasting, Shri Arun Jaitley ji needs no introduction. I would still like to share a few things about him. Shri Jaitley has held key cabinet portfolios of commerce and industry and law and justice in the NDA government from 1998 to 2004. He was the leader of opposition in Rajya Sabha from 2009 to 2014. He was very active and made a mark in Indian politics right from his student days. He is also an eminent lawyer. As Minister of Law and Justice and Company Affairs, he was the architect of the competition law in India. Given his vast knowledge and experience in the fields of law, commerce, and governance, we could not have had a better speaker for the topic of today's lecture, which is competition, regulator, and growth. May I now request Honorable Minister to please deliver the annual day lecture.
The chairperson of the Competition Appellate Tribunal, Justice G.S. Singhvi, the chairman of the Competition Commission, Shri D.K. Sikri, distinguished judges, members of the Appellate Tribunal, members of the Commission, members of the bar who are present here, ladies and gentlemen. Let me at the very outset express my gratitude to Mr. Sikri and his colleagues for having invited me to deliver this annual lecture of the Competition Commission of India. Many distinguished speakers that he named in the past 3 years have had the opportunity and privilege of delivering this lecture. Competition law really in India has evolved over the last 6-7 years. Even though the bill was passed in 2002, it had a little checkered history that the Competition Commission could not be established only and made functional in 2009. I don't think at the time when we passed the bill, except experts who were dealing with the subject, the others were at that time very conscious of the importance and the magnitude of what we were enacting and the institution we were creating. Nonetheless, in the last 7 years of its functioning, as was mentioned just now by Justice Singhvi, hundreds of cases have been decided. Many have gone to the appeal tribunal and thereafter to the higher courts. A good institutional mechanism has been created. A robust bar has developed. Several publications have already come out. And I meet a lot of young, very bright lawyers who very proudly tell me that they are specializing in this subject. Because as they would learn from their counterparts elsewhere in the world, the competition practice, which is more popularly referred to world over as the antitrust practice, is one of the most expanding areas where business, economy, and law blend with each other. If you look at the reasons and the rationale why it was necessary in India as elsewhere in the world, the reasons are obvious, particularly from the brief comment that Mr. Sikri just now made. Our founding fathers indeed took many great steps, but encouraging competition was not one of them. The manner in which our economic system was designed immediately after independence, it was inherently anti-competitive. It was anti-competitive because we chose a path of regulated economy. And regulated economy necessarily meant that there were entry point barriers as far as businesses were concerned. When we initially enacted the MRTP Act and then redid it in the 70s, the basis of the act itself was that size is evil. And therefore, anything which is larger in size, which encourages economies of scale, promotes efficiencies, itself will have a tendency to monopolize, and therefore that should be discouraged. That inherently created inefficiencies. If we look at the Constitution as a document, and if we read the exceptions to the fundamental right of freedom of trade, one of the reasonable restrictions is, and which is a justified restriction, that the state is entitled to create monopolies. So if there is a state monopoly, that can't be challenged. Because the basis of free trade was that private monopolies are bad, but state monopolies can itself be created. That's in the Fundamental Rights chapter itself. Obviously, the economic order was dominated with the excessive licensing, and this led to a great amount of sluggishness as far as the economy is concerned. Large consumer choice was restricted. So if you wanted to manufacture an automobile and you needed a license, it was for the state to decide how much competition to be restricted. And therefore, for decades, we were denied that choice. So if we now go back to the pre-1991 scenario, we had actually, in a non-competitive environment, lived in an era of shortages. So if you needed a telephone connection, you may wait for 2 decades. If you wanted to buy a two-wheeler automobile, you had to pay either some extra money or stand in the queue for an indefinite period of time. If you wanted to buy an automobile, there was inherently a delay. And in that environment of shortages, the Supreme Court was not an activist court at that time. So all kinds of discretions were permitted. When I first became a member of parliament, on the very first day, I was given 2 booklets containing coupons. The first one was, and Article 14 had not been made so effective at that time, the first one was that we had a power to sanction out-of-turn telephone connections. The second one was that we had a power to sanction out-of-turn gas connections. My seniors in parliament, Mr. Vajpayee reminded us that when he was a member of parliament, and he was referring to the 1970s and not 50s, they were also given coupons to allocate 2 HMT watches every year out of turn. Now, in a non-competitive environment, discretions to get allocations an era of shortages, an economy of shortages, restriction of consumer choice, and obviously this had an impact on growth itself, that these were the eras where we relished in what the world taunted us with, that India has a Hindu rate of growth. So the 2%, 2.5% rate of growth we had was sarcastically referred to by the rest of the world as the Hindu rate of growth. And I think in 1991, it was the then compelling situation which had its own impact on India, and we undertook the first steps towards the reform process. And obviously the impact of that itself is history. And once we were doing away with the monopolies, we were doing away with the state licensing, a competition law or an antitrust law itself was inevitable. It was for the first time in 1999 that Mr. Yashwant Sinha in his budget speech announced that India would now undertake a competition law. At the time when we undertook the competition law, there was an expert committee which was appointed, it gave its report, there were several sittings held, the law was introduced in Parliament, it went to a standing committee, and thereafter it was approved. But our mindsets had not changed completely. And therefore the creation of the institution of a regulator, whether in the competition field or in any other field, did create ripples in the system. And it was these ripples which effectively delayed the 2002 law being more effectively implemented till 2009. One of the concerns that Parliament had, and obviously one of the concerns that ministers in the government had in relation to various sectoral regulators, was that it was still taking us time that there can be good decision-making outside the government setup. I recollect in the context of telecom, one of the ministers in fact told Parliament, I am answerable to you, I am accountable to the people, but why are the tariffs being picked up by somebody else? How do I justify these tariffs? And he publicly differed with the regulator in tariff fixation. So it was a considerable amount of difficulty that the executive had in digesting that there would be regulators outside the executive mechanism, the rationale of it which I'll just go into, who would take important economic decisions, and that the system would have to accept those decisions. But really the 7-year delay did not take place because of that. The 7 years delay took place, this time not because of a minister or Parliament, but because the Supreme Court thought that how can somebody who's not a judge be a chairman of a competition commission? And therefore the Supreme Court itself stayed the functioning of the commission. And after a great deal of arguments, the Act itself was amended. And the appeal tribunal, which was not a part of the original Act, was then created. And I'm glad that happened for a reason, that became a good settled model for Indian regulators. I say that, Justice Singhvi, because one of the great difficulties in creating a regulator was, and this did happen at the time when the TRAI was created, that every time TRAI took a decision in relation to any telecommunication matter, there would be a writ petition filed in the High Court. Now, those commercial decisions had to be implemented expeditiously, and the High Courts had a very busy calendar. And that busy calendar would actually render it impossible for them to decide the case urgently. So the TRAI decisions themselves could not be implemented for years altogether. Parallelly, this question arose in the context of the Competition Commission, that what if the same happens in the context of the Competition Commission? That every time a decision is taken, it gets the only forum for challenge would be the high courts, and it would remain pending there. And therefore, around the same time, I think a good reform came, that it would be the experts who would head the regulatory mechanism, and a mix of those experts and a judicial experience would hear appeals against that before they could finally be challenged before an appropriate court, which in that case then became the Supreme Court itself. And that's how, by 2009, we made a delayed beginning as far as the Competition Commission was concerned. I think the moot question is, and that's the difference between the regulated economy and the market economy, as to why we need to promote and encourage competition. And the rationale is very clear. Competition creates innovations. Competition will always promote change and improvement. Competition will ensure efficiency. Competition will create new technologies. Competition will always provide you with a price competitiveness. That if you have a multiple choice of products, then in terms of its price competitiveness, each competes with each other. Competition would provide the consumer a choice as to which of the multiple products a consumer is entitled to purchase. And therefore, the consumer choice is much wider. And that itself promotes the quality of the product. Or in cases of services, it promotes the quality of services. Competition is at the heart of a market economy. Socialism per se is anti-competitive. Because socialism per se promotes state and encourages state monopolies. And monopolies by their very character are anti-competitive. Monopolies are always terrible for everyone except for the entity which owns the monopoly. And therefore, monopolies are never in consumer interest. It's always competition which is in consumer interest. And competition itself creates a race between people where the best product or the best service always wins. I often recollect a story which many of us must have heard as children about two friends going for a walk in a dense forest where they heard the roar of a tiger. So the cleverer one amongst the two immediately opened his bag and started changing his shoes and putting on his racing shoes. So the second friend asked him, "Do you think with these shoes on you can beat the tiger?" He says, "The idea is to beat you and not the tiger." Well, that's what competition is all about. And therefore, competition creates that kind of innovation. It creates that kind of quality itself. Any form of restrictions at times can curtail competition. In terms of technology and capital, when we put restrictions, we actually cut down on competition. If we look at the direct impact of even foreign direct investment on competition, investment becomes the starting point of an economic activity. The investor who brings in his capital is no philanthropist. He brings it in for the idea of earning profit. and therefore he brings with him the best of technologies. He then provides you with the most competitive in terms of quality and cost of product, where he wants to beat the rest of the market. And if we look at our experience in many fields, look at what state monopolies did to telecommunications in India. The linesman was, till the mid-90s, the most important man in our lives. You had a 0.8% tele density in a country. And the moment you ended the state monopoly and brought in competition, and as we gradually brought in capital from wherever we could with the best of technologies, we became one of the largest and the cheapest services in the world. Look at what happened to the automobile sector in India. We had the most obsolete automobile sector in India. We allowed technologies, we allowed capital to come in as a competition. And today we have the most competitive automobile sector in India. And if we see the success stories of these sectors, take insurance for instance. We are amongst the most underinsured societies in India. And one of the great challenges of social security in India is how does India translate into an insured society from an uninsured society? And therefore, our reliance on a service sector like insurance, only on state monopolies, did not allow the sector to really expand. And now that in terms of products, in terms of capital, we seem to be expanding, over the next decade or two, where multiplicity of choice to the consumer, new innovative products itself are going to make a significant difference. If we look at what's happened in the last few years to the banking sector, the banking sector is an example where, after the nationalization of the state sector banks, we had large state sector banks. Today, in competition to the large state sector banks, you have banking licenses available on tap. You have payment gateways. You have internet banking. And you have various other forms of banking, and a facility which is almost expanding by the day. Which of the two scenarios is more consumer friendly, and which of the two scenarios is more friendly to the larger character of the economy itself? I think a great turning point as far as competition is concerned is the advent of e-commerce. Now, the advent of e-commerce and competition will completely change the nature of business, as it will make many of our laws and even sectoral limits completely redundant. A consumer who had to go from store to store, scouting for a product, and then deciding as to which one to buy, has now a global choice of products available to him at home. So his choice is much bigger. His price competitiveness options are much bigger. In terms of size, it has changed the world altogether. I'll give you two examples. Just pick up the list of the pre-1991 top 25 business houses in India and compare it with the top 25 today. You have two sets of people: those who functioned in that limited opening out available pre-1991. And post-1991, you have unknown names which suddenly came to the center stage, who developed new ideas, new technologies, and became great players. If you look up and compare that list of 25 who existed then and who are today, you probably may not even find 5 names in common. That is the difference that competition has done to us. The other difference that it has done to us is that there is a lot more value as far as ideas are concerned. And if you look at that value, an example I've been repeatedly giving, which is the largest transport company in the world? The answer is, it's a company which doesn't own a single vehicle. By just using technology applications, Uber has today become the largest transport company in the world. And that is the power which innovation, enterprise, and competition gives to them. And now in innovative ideas, even within domestic economy, it starts facing challenge from similar other products. Who's the largest retailer in the world? He doesn't own a single store. That is how in the last few years, e-commerce itself has promoted the idea of commerce and made it a lot more competition-friendly itself. I think in terms of competition being encouraged, international trade, also its dimensions have changed. I remember in the 1990s, a developing economy like ours used to absolutely fear competition internationally, particularly from the set of rules which the WTO was intending to design for various economies in the world. We were always seen as somebody who resisted the trade pacts. And I could see that transformation taking place between the 90s and the first decade of this century, that suddenly a fundamental change came in global trade. And the new principle of global trade was that earlier we had thought it was the United States of America, North America, Europe, the European Union, which have devised these instruments in order to economically dominate the world. But suddenly the whole idea changed. And the new idea which competition had encouraged was that the new meaning of international trade was that he who can provide goods or services of good quality at the cheapest rate will dominate the market. And therefore, except high technology areas, financial markets, suddenly you found that the developed economies now wanted to somehow change the agenda and stall the dialogue. Because it was China, it was Thailand, it was other low-cost economies which were dominating the goods section, and it was economies like India which were dominating the services. So we were always aggressive on services. The cost at which an Indian law firm can provide its services is far more competitive than the cost at which a London or a New York-based law firm can provide the same services. The cost at which an Indian hospital can do life-saving surgeries is a fraction of what their counterparts internationally can do. The cost at which Bangladesh could supply apparel and ready-made garments was much cheaper than the rate at which Europe and the United States could do. And therefore, the dimension of international trade itself had changed. And this also reduced the power of the governments. I remember in the 1980s, when people complained of bad telephone services, a minister at that time, Mr. Stephens, had said those who are dissatisfied can return their connections. Now, a comment of this kind could only be made where state monopolies existed. Competition has now completely eliminated the scope as far as such areas are concerned. There is also a difference particularly when you adjudicate these matters, between competition in the matter of services and competition in the matter of manufactured goods. If there are anti-competitive practices as far as manufacturing is concerned, the concerns are always lesser because by playing with the tariffs, you can expand the market and therefore get the same products at a cheaper price from internationally. And therefore, the ability of a local producer to manipulate the market would always be less. But in case it's services, the scope for doing that is always inherently lesser. And therefore, the yardsticks itself would have to be lesser. But there are still areas where we haven't opened up to competition. And therefore, you can see the difference between those areas. Take, for example, civil aviation, where we've opened up for competition. Multiple airlines, multiple consumer choices, multiple routes, different tariffs, attractive services. Therefore, the consumer really becomes the master to decide as to which of the facilities that he must avail of. Contradistinct it with the services as far as the railways is concerned. Probably the world's largest network of railways, the absence of competition has prevented the consumer from getting the same quality of service, which has over the last 2 decades translated onto the airlines. Now contradistinct it further with still a relatively lesser performing sector, even compared to the railways, and which is the state transport undertakings. City after city in the country, state after state, lacks an adequate state transport service. It's the last of the anti-competitive areas where licensing is the rule, corruption is the norm, and inadequacy to the consumer is the phenomena. In the budget this year, we have proposed that since it's a concurrent list subject, that we'll be going in for a legislation getting rid of the licensing regime as far as this area is concerned, so that it can be freed up for competition itself. And therefore, if we see the virtues of competition, I think the glaring example before us, which we have to compare for ourselves, is civil aviation versus railways versus state transport undertakings. Now, if we look at the impact of all this on consumers, I was just trying to collect some data. Air passengers in India, the difference between 2001 and 2016, 1.7 crores a year has now become 8.3 crores. Cost of telephony, by encouraging competition, between 99 and now, came down from 16.9 rupees a minute to 0.5 rupees a minute. Tele-density went up because we encouraged competition from 0.8% in 1999 to 74.1% as of today. The auto sector, between 2000 and 2015, 5.13 lakh four-wheel vehicles manufactured every year, has gone up to, in 2015, to 33.78. And therefore, in every sector where competition is increased, the quality of service has increased. Obviously, the increase in the economy also has contributed to this. I think the difference itself is self-evident. There are still some areas which we have conventionally followed in governments, And we thought, and lawyers and judges dealing with this would be very familiar with this, is to provide to a state sector company either a purchase preference or a price preference. It's based on the assumption that these are government companies, their efficiency standards are less, and therefore they must be protected. Now, does this protect them, or does this incentivize inefficiencies? Anywhere in the world, you'll be told that the latter is the case itself. The essence of improving on competition is to facilitate an easy entry and permit and facilitate an easy exit. An easy entry itself helps us in the ease of doing business, and therefore the entry point restrictions must get eliminated. The nature of investment itself was an entry point restriction, and therefore over the last few years we have systematically liberalized it. The conditionalities attached to it is an entry point restriction. We've been getting rid of a large number of those restrictions. Years spent in environmental permissions is an entry point restriction. FIPB clearances not being granted for years is an entry point restriction, and therefore these are ones where we've gradually become more efficient. A great disincentive is the possibility of anybody challenging it. And against newer investment proposals, PILs being entertained. That's an entry point restriction which dissuades people from investing. And obviously, if we look at today, in most of these areas, we've made a significant headway. And therefore, our ratings in the ease of doing business are globally moving up. But if we look at correspondingly what happens in the States, particularly in the real estate transactions and constructions, amongst 189 countries, we still have a ranking deficit, and we are at the fag end. And therefore, you may have a very liberal FDI policy for entry, you may have a very quick FIPB permission, a quick environmental permission, access to financing. But when he goes to the state, it takes him 5 years to get a building plan cleared and to set up a plant. The entire process of ease of doing business itself comes to a naught. And he decides to choose a better destination elsewhere. And therefore, the economy doesn't grow in our areas. Exit was an impossibility. I've always believed that the SICA Act, which provided for the BIFR, was a flawed piece of legislation. It hardly resulted in revival of companies. It merely provided to the failed companies an iron curtain against creditors. Fortunately, with the passage of the Bankruptcy and Insolvency Code now, that would now go. And therefore, the Bankruptcy Code itself would facilitate an easy exit. An investor doesn't want to invest in a jurisdiction where the investment, if it runs foul, makes it almost impossible to exit his investment itself. And therefore, now with that proper regime being created, there would be a significant improvement in that area. There's one important point on competition which I wish to make before going on to the other two subparts of this subject. Being pro-business alone is not enough. Being pro-competition is essential to be with pro-business. If you are pro-business without being pro-competition, the consequences can be very dangerous. Take the example of Russia. They went in for a lot of privatization. Because they were not pro-competition, the entire privatization resulted in the creation of the oligarchs. And oligarchs again meant monopolies. So any pro-business policy had per se to be also pro-competition, because without being pro-competition, being pro-business itself can encourage oligarchs, it can encourage crony capitalism, which itself is dangerous. On regulators, as I said, we went through a phase where we decided to have experts as regulators. And people also learned on the jobs. And I think the other important underlying factor on regulators in various fields was that when we transformed from a regulated economy to a market economy, let us not forget that the government in each of those fields had a dual capacity. In telecom, through the BSNL and the MTNL, the government was a player. It was also the rule maker. In insurance, the government had the GIC companies and the LIC. So it was an important participant. The government was, through its own instrumentalities, doing business. It was also the rule maker. And therefore, any private participant would say that my competitor can't set the rules of the game. And therefore, the need to have a regulator at an arm's length distance from the government was absolutely necessary. And that is the answer to the minister who said, how can I be accountable to the country and parliament and somebody else makes the laws? Because the minister had a dual capacity. He also had an interest in making sure that the government companies that under him functioned well. And therefore, any rule that he made would have an institutional bias in favor of those government companies. And the regulators and the competitors who wanted to put in money for a private investment would say, we can't trust a regime where my competitor is also the rule maker. And it was this persuading logic which created a situation where the regulator had to be at arm's length distance. And therefore, whether it was the RBI in the case of the banking system or SEBI in the case of the capital markets or TRAI in the context of telephone or for the market economy itself, the Competition Commission, this was extremely important. With regard to the Competition Commission, it was necessary because ordinarily one would trust markets more than you trust the governments. And therefore, the market economy functions on a principle that the markets will find its own levels. But then there are always dangers of aberrations in the market economy. And therefore, the three aberrations that you deal with, the anti-competitive practices, the abuse of dominance, and the elimination of competition by a process of amalgamation and mergers, itself could create a situation which would be highly detrimental to the growth of competition itself. And I think regulators now for over a decade and a half in various fields have been functioning effectively. And the country, by and large, the polity, the participants, the courts have all got used to the autonomy and independence of the regulators. The more we professionalize them, the better it is for our economy. What is the impact of all this on growth? A competitive economy which allows investment to be fairly treated, which allows the best product or the best service to succeed, eventually becomes the attractive point for global investments. Today, world over, people have investments. And when they choose never to invest in a sluggish economy. They want to invest in a more competitive economy. They want to invest in a fair economy. They want to invest in an economy where entry is easy, where exit is easy, where the rules of business are fair. an economy which carries credibility. And therefore, if you have an investment coming in, it's quite obvious that it becomes the starting point of all economic activity, which eventually not only increases that economic activity, which increases revenues, which enables the state to discharge its obligations, particularly towards the weaker sections. It creates jobs. It adds to growth rates. An economy without investment can never add to its growth rates. And I think as we've embarked on this experiment, our post-91 experience has certainly been a much better experience than what existed pre-1991. And therefore, having traveled a long way, I think the faster we move on this path, the more competition, the more consumer welfare, the better products, and probably a more buoyant economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir, for a very enriching and thought-provoking lecture. You have very succinctly brought out how competition has played a key role in empowering the common man and the development of the economy. Your lecture has emphasized to need to provide an ecosystem where competition can thrive. The points made by you, sir, will be extremely useful for a young body like CCI, the entire competition law fraternity, the lawmakers, and all the stakeholders of the economy. The Honorable Minister has kindly consented to take a few questions. May I now request Honorable Chairman CCI to take the proceedings forward.
Well, the lecture was really a treat, and we must thank the Honorable Minister for the canvas he has provided to us. I think he deserves a very strong round of applause from all of us. Thank you so much, sir. And he's very, very kind to take a few questions, because already he's spoken for 40 minutes and covered the whole gamut of issues. So I think we can take a few questions the audience has. Yeah, Mr. Haldia.
Sir, I wish to begin with my compliments for such a brilliant lecture. I want to apply it to the power sector. Everything that you say, I believe in. But in the power sector, despite the Electricity Act 2003, and despite the evolution of power sector in the entire developed world, there is, even today, no competition in supply of power. The Act is not implemented. To make matters worse, you talked about the Constitution making an exception for state monopolies, which actually means that the Constitution does not permit private monopolies. Yet, right under our nose in Delhi, we have 3 private monopolies for supply of power. I have made presentations and representations to all manner of fora, including the Competition Commission, but not a thing has been done. Because of that, like you mentioned, lack of competition prevents growth, so power sector has not grown. Since it is the mother industry, it has impacted the entire growth of the economy. Would you like to comment on that, sir?
I think you have a very valid point. And the reason is very simple, that the 2003 Act was a central law, but power sector, particularly distribution, and which is the real challenge in the power sector, is to be done entirely in the states. And the old mindset still continues to exist in a number of states, or in most of them, where states are unwilling to let go of the state distribution companies, which are the DISCOMs. Not only has competition, that is, for example, I have a choice today as to which mode of television communication I must have. I must have a cable, I must have a DTH, I must have a DTH from which company. I have a multiple option. On telephone, I have a choice. But de facto, the states have provided the consumer with no alternative choice as far as the DISCOMs are concerned. And I think the problem goes beyond your question. Some of the states feel that by not charging the consumer for the services that are provided to him, you earn political brownie points. This has not happened. The best case is Rajasthan, where a 15,000 debt of the Rajasthan DISCOM in 2008, by 2017 had touched a staggering 70,000. And when we hear by the day the bank NPA problems, one of the three largest contributors to the NPA is the state DISCOMs. So state governments merely thought, the act said if the state governments want to subsidize, they must pay out of their budget. So what they've done is they've taken loans from banks and are not repaying the loans to the banks, the state DISCOMs. And the problem in some of the states is very critical. And therefore, you are absolutely right, not creating competition, not allowing the users pay principle to apply, have both contributed to this aberration, which in the power sector still continues. So today we are at a situation where we have more power than what we need. So we are manufacturing and producing more power. We have a distribution network, a grid for the entire country. But when it reaches the state and reaches the consumer, the last mile problem, exactly what you mentioned, then begins. And that's a reform which is still to take place.
Any other question? Yeah, this side.
Sir, it was indeed amazing walking the journey back. Fantastic lecture, sir. Not too long ago, we were the third largest pharmaceutical company in India. And we have phenomenal competition in India. But the industry is not doing well because of the regulator. The price control mechanism is such that you have more spurious drugs in the market or products which are not originally manufactured by the companies and are sent to third parties. And therefore, these drugs which are not following the Schedule M or Schedule Y or certain qualification norms are coming out in the market. Just for an example, sir, we used to manufacture a drug called Lim-C, a vitamin C. And the NPPA decided to drop its price from X amount to Y. And we stopped production. And there was an extreme shortage because it was below our cost. Likewise, there are 300 and odd drugs which Supreme Court said that they should be brought under certain umbrella. Now this competition is so severe as it is. If you allowed, and it is one license Raj which needs to be removed, from competition, from regulation to monitoring, to control to monitoring, there is no reason why what has happened in aviation and what has happened in the telecom and other sectors will not happen. If just regulatory machinery switches a little bit to monitoring instead of controls. By all accounts, we can prove it to you, if need be, that a very large number, and it could exceed 25% of the drugs available in the India market, are substandard stroke spurious, including life-saving.
You see, the two are entirely different issues. Fake drugs, copycat drugs, adulterated drugs being circulated is an implementation issue. It's for the drug controller. I think when you speak in terms of competition, as far as pharmaceuticals are concerned, they stand on a specific footing. Because pharmaceuticals is one area where you need innovation And you need to balance that innovation with public health considerations. India still can't countenance a situation which exists in most part of the world where medicines become unaffordable. And therefore, we are an important hub for affordable medicines. We must continue to encourage that. But along with innovation, the affordability criteria, because of public health considerations, will always have to be borne in mind. Adulterated medicines is an implementation issue.
Yes. I think we'll take only 2 questions, one here and one after that.
Sir, it's not a question, but a compliment. I am N.K. Goyal from association called Tima Telecom Equipment. I want to compliment FM for the wonderful IPR policy they have announced recently. And we also compliment government and CCI for the wonderful judgment of Delhi High Court, because that will pave the way for making India in India. Thank you.
Okay. Yes.
When the legal sector will be opened up? My question. Legal sector for the foreigners.
You are the only ones objecting.
Okay. Yeah. Mr. Mehta.
Right. Thank you. I'm Pradeep Mehta. Very good tour de force, I would say, Minister, for this wonderful wide canvas speech. Covered everything possible. Now, I refer to the question, which is a point which was raised last year in the IPR policy. Indeed, that is something which you did not mention, where there has been a good balance between both investor concerns as well as public health issues. I must compliment the government for that. Now, we did adopt an IPR policy in spite of having several IPR laws. And at the same time, we've had a draft competition policy which can cover a very large number of issues which you've raised. And that is still pending adoption by the government. As you know, I've raised it with you a number of times, but I thought this might be a good opportunity to remind you that a draft policy is there which can cover most of the issues which you've spoken about, as well as deal with it. I mean, there are a lot of competition reforms which are taking place. Very rightly, you said that the bankruptcy law itself is a competition reform in a sense, because it allows exit and so, and probably we are all waiting for the GST to come, which will probably be one of the biggest competition reforms. Thank you, sir.
Well, I think the policy itself is, as a policy document, may or may not be needed. The fact is that the effort of the whole system is to encourage competition. So what I have said just now, and what the statutory bodies, the Competition Commission and the appellate body is actually doing is encouraging competition. There are hardly any areas of monopolies left now.
Thank you, sir.